Marcus Vane had been alone on this frozen world for 63 days when the sky turned black and the wind began to scream. The planet was called Karth 4 in the official records, though the miners who once worked here had other names for it. Names that were not fit for polite company. Names that spoke of bitter cold and death and the feeling of being forgotten by the universe itself. Marcus remembered the day they left him behind. Remembered standing at the landing pad as the last transport ship lifted off without him. Remembered the way the station manager had looked through him like he was already a ghost. Already a dead man walking on borrowed time. The Stellarium market had crashed overnight, and the mining consortium had made their calculations with cold precision, deciding that one maintenance engineer was not worth the cost of fuel for a return trip. Deciding that Marcus Vane was simply unacceptable. Lost in their quarterly reports, he had watched the ship disappear into the gray sky and felt something inside him harden into steel. They thought he would die within a week. And Marcus had decided that he would prove them wrong if only out of pure spite. The abandoned mining outpost became his kingdom. A small fortress against the endless frozen wasteland that stretched in every direction. And he had learned to survive through stubbornness and ingenuity, and a refusal to give the universe the satisfaction of killing him. He fixed the solar panels that powered the base and repaired the water recycler that turned ice into drinking water and set up hydroponic trays where engineered vegetables grew under artificial light. And slowly he built a life from the scraps that the corporation had left behind. The days passed in a rhythm of work and rest and careful rationing. And Marcus learned the patterns of this hostile world. Learned when the temperature would drop to levels that could freeze a man solid in minutes. Learned when the storms would come howling across the tundra like angry gods. He also learned about the wolves. The Karathi wolves were nothing like the wolves of Earth. Nothing like the creatures from the stories his grandmother used to tell him when he was a child, safe and warm on a world that now seemed like a distant dream. These wolves stood as tall as his chest on 6 powerful legs, with bodies built for speed and killing, with bioluminescent eyes that glowed silver in the darkness, with jaws that could bite through the reinforced plating of a mining suit. Marcus had seen them from a distance many times, watching from the shelter of his outpost as they moved across the frozen plains like shadows made flesh. Hunting the other creatures that somehow survived in this brutal place, he had seen what they could do to their prey, had found the remains left behind after a hunt. And he knew that if they ever decided he was food, then no weapon he possessed would save him. But the wolves had kept their distance from his outpost, perhaps sensing that this strange 2-legged creature was not worth the trouble. Perhaps simply having no interest in something so small and weak. Marcus had been grateful for their indifference. On the 63rd day, the atmospheric sensors began to scream their warning, and Marcus felt ice form in his stomach that had nothing to do with the cold a Class 7 storm was coming. The kind of storm that turned the sky into a wall of frozen death. The kind of storm that could bury his outpost under meters of ice. The kind of storm that killed everything caught in its path. He had 4 hours to prepare. Marcus worked with desperate efficiency, sealing the blast shutters over every window, checking the power systems and heating units, securing anything that might be damaged by the violent shaking that would come when the storm hit. He was sealing the final shutter on the main cargo bay when he heard something that made him freeze in place. It was a sound he had learned to fear. The sound of multiple large bodies moving across frozen ground. The sound of the wolves. Marcus turned slowly toward the reinforced window and felt his heart stop beating for a long, terrible moment. 15 wolves were coming across the plain, heading directly toward his outpost, their glowing eyes cutting through the gathering darkness like fallen stars. His hand moved automatically to the plasma cutter at his hip. the only weapon he had that might hurt one of these creatures. Though he knew it would be useless against so many, he waited for the attack. Waited for them to circle his outpost and search for weak points. Waited for the sound of claws scraping against metal as they tried to find a way inside. But the attack did not come. Instead, the wolves stopped about 50 meters from his door and stood there in the howling wind. And Marcus saw something in the way they held themselves that he had not expected to see. They were not hunting. They were running. He looked more carefully and noticed that 3 of the wolves were limping badly. Their legs injured in some way he could not determine. And one of them, a smaller wolf that must have been young, was being half-carried by 2 adults who pressed against its sides to keep it upright. Behind him, the storm front was rising like a wall of darkness that was swallowing the sky itself. Marcus understood with sudden clarity what was happening. The wolves had been caught far from there. Den, when the storm formed, had been injured in some accident or fight, and now they were desperately searching for shelter, any shelter that might protect them from the killing cold. They would not survive in the open. And somehow they had come to his door, the largest wolf, a gray female with old scars crossing her muzzle in a pattern that spoke of many battles survived. Separated from the pack and walked closer to the outpost. She stopped and raised her head and looked directly at Marcus through the reinforced glass. There was no aggression in her gaze. No threat, no hunger. There was only desperation. Only the knowledge of approaching death. Only a plea that needed no words to be understood. Marcus thought about everything he knew. Thought about how these creatures were apex predators that could tear him apart in seconds. Thought about how letting them inside would be suicide by any rational measure. He thought about the corporation that had left him to die. About the humans who had calculated his life in terms of fuel costs. About how his own species had abandoned him without a second thought. He thought about what it meant to be alone. About what it meant to be desperate. About what it meant to need help from someone who had every reason to refuse. Marcus Vane walked to the main door of his outpost and placed his hand on the release lever. Every survival instinct in his body was screaming at him to stop, to keep the door sealed, to save himself and let the wolves die in the storm. He opened the door anyway. The wolves poured through the open door like a river of muscle and fur and barely contained violence. Marcus pressed himself against the wall as they rushed past him, feeling the heat of their massive bodies, smelling the wild musk of their fur, hearing the click of their claws against the metal floor of his cargo. Bay 15 apex predators filled the space that had once held mining equipment and supply crates, circling and pacing and filling the air with sounds that made every instinct in his body scream with fear. He reached for the door controls and sealed the entrance. Just as the first wave of the storm slammed into the outpost with a force that shook the walls and made the lights flicker, the wind outside rose to a howl that sounded like the screaming of 1,000 dying things. And the temperature sensors showed the outside air dropping to levels that would kill an unprotected human in less than a minute inside the cargo bay. Marcus stood very still and tried to remember how to breathe. The wolves were agitated by their sudden imprisonment, pacing in tight circles, snapping at each other with jaws that could crush bone, their glowing eyes sweeping the space and always returning to him. He was trapped in a room with 15 creatures that could kill him before he could even scream. And he had done this to himself, had opened the door with his own hands, had invited death into his home. The pulse rifle in his hands felt like a toy, a child's pretend weapon against monsters from a nightmare. He might be able to kill one wolf before the others reached him. Maybe 2 if he was lucky. But there were 15 of them, and they were faster than anything he had ever seen. The gray female, the one with the scarred muzzle who seemed to lead the pack, had positioned herself between Marcus and the other wolves. She was watching him with those silver eyes that glowed in the dim light of the cargo bay. and he could not read what thoughts moved behind that alien gaze. Marcus kept his back against the wall and tried to make himself as small as possible, tried to become invisible, tried to will himself into a state where the wolves might forget he was there. The first hour passed in a haze of terror that left his muscles aching and his heart pounding against his ribs. The wolves gradually began to calm, their pacing becoming slower, their aggressive sounds becoming less frequent. But the tension in the air remained thick enough to choke on. Marcus noticed that the pack had arranged itself in a pattern that seemed deliberate, with the stronger wolves near the walls and the weaker ones protected in the center. The injured juvenile that he had seen being carried across the plain was lying in the middle of the group, surrounded by adults who pressed close to share their body heat. It was making a sound that Marcus had never heard from these creatures before. A high, thin whine that spoke of pain and fear and the kind of suffering that needed no translation. He could see its length now in the light of the cargo bay, could see the torn flesh and the frozen blood and the way the limb bent at an angle that nature had never intended. The wound was bad, infected maybe, and the cold had only made it worse. Without treatment, the young wolf would die. And Marcus could see in the way the adults pressed against it that they knew this truth even if they could not speak it. He thought about the medical kit in his quarters, thought about the synthetic tissue that could seal wounds and the antibiotics that could fight infections, thought about all the supplies he had hoarded for his own survival. He thought about the fact that he was insane for even considering what he was considering. The juvenile whined again, and one of the adult wolves licked its face in a gesture that looked exactly like comfort, exactly like love, exactly like the kind of care that Marcus had once believed only humans could feel. He remembered his grandmother on Earth, remembered the way she would sit by his bed when he was sick and press a cool cloth to his forehead and tell him stories until the fever broke. He remembered being small and afraid and knowing that someone was there who would not let him suffer alone. The gray female was still watching him, still standing between him and the pack. And Marcus suddenly understood what she was doing. She was protecting them from him. This scarred old wolf, this leader of killers, was positioning herself to die first if the human attacked, was offering herself as a shield for the weaker members of her family. Marcus lowered the pulse rifle and placed it on the ground at his feet. The gray female's ears moved forward and her silver eyes narrowed. But she did not move, did not attack, only watched as this strange creature surrendered its only weapon. Marcus held up his empty hands and spoke in a voice that shook only slightly. He told the wolves that he meant no harm, that he was going to get something that might help the injured one, that he needed to move past them to reach his quarters. He did not know if they could understand his words, but he hoped they could understand his tone, hoped they could read his intent in the way he moved, slowly and carefully with no sudden gestures. The gray female tilted her head and made a sound that was almost a question. Then she stepped aside. Marcus walked through the cargo bay on legs that felt like water, passing within arm's reach of wolves that could have killed him with a single bite, feeling their eyes on his back like the pressure of a physical weight. He reached his quarters and gathered the medical supplies with hands that trembled from something more complex than fear. When he returned to the cargo bay, the pack had shifted, had created an opening around the injured juvenile as if they somehow understood what he intended to do. Marcus knelt beside the young wolf and looked into eyes that glowed with pain and confusion and just the faintest spark of hope. He got to work. The juvenile wolf snapped at his hands when he first touched the wound, and Marcus jerked back just in time to keep his fingers. The adult wolves pressed closer, a wall of muscle and teeth that surrounded him on every side, and he could feel their hot breath on his neck as he knelt there with his heart hammering in his chest. One wrong move and they would tear him apart. He forced himself to breathe slowly, forced himself to speak in a calm, steady voice, even though every word felt like it was being pulled from his throat by force. He told the young wolf that he was trying to help, that the pain would stop soon, that everything was going to be okay. The gray female moved forward and did something that made Marcus freeze in amazement. She pressed her scarred muzzle against the juvenile's head and made a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor, and the young wolf slowly relaxed, its body going loose as it gave itself over to whatever command its leader had given. Marcus did not waste the opportunity. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic solution, and the juvenile flinched but did not snap at him again. Applied the synthetic tissue compound that would bond with the damaged flesh and promote healing. Working carefully to cover every part of the injury, he injected the antibiotics into the muscle of the wolf's shoulder, hoping that alien biology was close enough to Earth mammals for the drugs to work. Through all of this, the gray female kept her muzzle pressed against the juvenile's head and kept making that low rumbling sound. And the other wolves stood in a circle around them like guardians, keeping watch over something precious. Marcus worked for nearly an hour, doing everything his limited medical training allowed, using every supply he could spare for a creature that had no logical reason to trust him. When he was finished, the juvenile was sleeping, its breathing slow and steady, and the wound was sealed beneath a layer of synthetic tissue that glowed faintly blue in the dim light. Marcus sat back on his heels and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for his entire life. The gray female raised her head and looked at him with those silver eyes, and he saw something there that he had not expected: recognition, understanding, perhaps even gratitude. She moved toward him slowly, her massive body rippling with power that could have broken him in half. And Marcus forced himself to stay still as she approached. She stopped with her face centimeters from his own, so close that he could see the individual hairs on her muzzle and smell the wild, clean scent of her breath. Then she pressed her nose against his forehead and held it there for a long moment. A touch that felt like a blessing or a claim, or perhaps both at once. When she pulled away, something had changed in the room. Something that Marcus could feel even if he could not name it. The tension that had filled the cargo bay began to drain away like water from a broken vessel. The wolves stopped, watching him with the wariness of predators sizing up potential prey, and began to settle into positions of rest, lying down with their heads on their paws and their eyes half closed. Several of them moved to the doors and ventilation shafts and positioned themselves there like guards on watch. And Marcus realized with a start that they were establishing a perimeter, were treating this space as territory to be protected rather than a cage to be endured. He laughed before he could stop himself. A strange broken sound that echoed off the metal walls. The gray female tilted her head at the noise, but did not seem alarmed. Marcus found a spot near the wall that was not occupied by wolves and sat down with his back against the cold metal, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. He should not be alive right now. He should be a pile of torn meat on the cargo bay floor, another victim of the apex predators that ruled this frozen world. Another forgotten casualty of humanity's careless expansion into the stars. Instead, he was sitting in a room full of wolves who had apparently decided that he was not worth killing, and he was too tired to even be properly afraid anymore. The storm raged outside with a fury that shook the walls and filled the air with the howl of wind that could kill. But inside the cargo bay, a strange peace had settled over everything. Marcus began to talk. Not because he expected the wolves to understand, but because the silence felt too heavy to bear. He told them about Earth, about green forests and blue oceans and cities that stretched toward the sky, about the home he had left behind when he signed on with the mining consortium and the family he had not seen in 3 years. He told them about the betrayal, about watching the ship leave without him, About the moment he realized that his own species had decided he was not worth saving. He told them about the 63 days of loneliness, about talking to himself just to hear a voice, about forgetting what it felt like to be touched by another living thing. The gray female watched him as he spoke, her silver eyes unblinking, and Marcus could almost believe that she understood every word. When exhaustion finally claimed him, he slept sitting up against the wall, surrounded by predators that could have killed him at any moment. And it was the most peaceful sleep he had known since the day he was abandoned. He dreamed of running across frozen plains with wolves at his side, their breath making clouds in the cold air, their bodies warm against his own. In the dream, he was not alone. In the dream, he was part of something larger than himself, something ancient and fierce and loyal in ways that humans had forgotten how to be. He woke several times during the night, and each time found the gray female watching over him, her silver eyes glowing in the darkness like twin moons. Each time he fell back asleep, feeling safer than he had any right to feel. The storm continued for 3 days. During that time, Marcus learned things about the wolves that no xenobiologist had ever documented, things that changed his understanding of what these creatures truly were. They were not simply predators, not simply killing machines that hunted and ate and slept. They were a family. He watched the way the adults cared for the juvenile as it healed, bringing it portions of their own body heat, cleaning its fur with rough tongues, making soft sounds that seemed to comfort it when the pain became too much. He watched the way the younger adults deferred to the gray female in everything, waiting for her approval before eating or drinking or moving to new positions in the cargo bay. He watched the way they communicated with each other through sounds and gestures and subtle shifts in posture that created a language as complex as any human tongue, and slowly, impossibly, he watched them begin to accept him. It started with small things. One of the younger wolves, a brown and silver creature with a playful energy that reminded Marcus of a dog he had owned as a child, began to approach him without the wariness that had marked their first hours together. It would lie near him while he worked on repairs to the outpost, watching his hands with curious eyes, sometimes making small sounds that seemed like questions. Marcus started talking to it, explaining what he was doing as if the wolf could understand, and the creature would tilt its head and listen with an attention that felt almost human. The gray female observed these interactions without interfering, her silver eyes tracking every movement, but her body remained relaxed and unthreatening. Marcus came to understand that she was allowing this, was giving her pack permission to explore this strange relationship with the human who had saved one of their young. On the second day of the storm, the juvenile stood for the first time since Marcus had treated its wound. The synthetic tissue had bonded well, and the antibiotics had fought off the infection. And though the young wolf still limped when it walked, there was a brightness in its eyes that had not been there before. It approached Marcus with a hesitance that made his heart ache, stopping several times to look back at the gray female as if seeking guidance. The female made a soft sound, and the juvenile continued forward until it was standing directly in front of him, then pressed its head against his chest and held it there. And Marcus felt tears running down his face for the first time in months. He wrapped his arms around the young wolf and held it, feeling the warmth of its body and the beating of its heart, and the simple, profound reality of another living creature choosing to trust him. The other wolves watched this happen, and something shifted in the way they looked at him, something that felt like the crossing of a threshold that could never be uncrossed. After that, they began to touch him, not aggressively, not with any threat, but casually, almost affectionately, brushing against him as they passed, pressing their bodies against his when they settled down to rest, including him in the physical closeness that seemed to define their pack. Marcus found himself sleeping in a pile of wolves, surrounded by warm bodies and steady breathing. And he woke each morning feeling less alone than he had felt since the day he was born. He began to understand their communication. Not the specific meanings of each sound, but the emotional content beneath them. The feelings they were expressing through their strange alien language. He learned to recognize the sound that meant contentment and the sound that meant concern and the sound that meant something was wrong and attention was needed. He learned to read their body language, to know when they were happy or worried or playful or tired, and they learned to read him. The gray female seemed to understand his moods better than any human ever had, appearing at his side when he felt sad, giving him space when he needed solitude, offering her solid presence when anxiety crept into his thoughts. She never demanded anything from him, never pushed for attention or affection, simply made herself available and let him decide what he needed. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for him. On the third day of the storm, Marcus realized that he no longer wanted the wolves to leave. The thought startled him at first. Seemed like madness when he examined it in the cold light of reason. These were apex predators, creatures that had killed armed humans before, creatures that belonged to the wild, frozen plains of this brutal world, and yet they had become something else to him, had become companions in a way that defied every logical argument against such a relationship. He looked at the gray female and saw not a monster but a leader, a protector, a being of dignity and intelligence who had chosen to extend trust to a creature that, by all rights, should have been her prey. He looked at the juvenile who now followed him everywhere and saw not a threat but a friend, a young soul who had been saved from death and who repaid that saving with boundless loyalty. He looked at the pack and saw not killers, but family, not predators, but people, not animals, but equals in the great struggle of survival that defined all life everywhere. The storm began to weaken on the morning of the fourth day. The wind died down and the temperature outside began to rise toward levels that were merely dangerous rather than instantly fatal. The wolves grew restless, pacing near the doors, looking toward the outside world that was their true home. Marcus knew that the moment had come. He walked to the main door and placed his hand on the release lever, feeling the cold metal against his palm, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. The gray female appeared at his side and looked up at him with those silver eyes that had become as familiar as his own reflection. He opened the door. The light that flooded in was golden and pure, the sun rising over a world that had been scoured clean by the storm, the ice fields glittering like scattered diamonds beneath a sky of perfect blue. It was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. One by one, the wolves moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at him, and he could see in their eyes something that might have been farewell. The gray female was the last to go. She stood beside him for a long moment, her shoulder pressed against his leg, and Marcus thought she might stay, might choose to remain in this strange shelter with this strange creature who had somehow become pack. Then she walked through the door and out into the brilliant morning, and Marcus watched her go with a heart that felt like it was breaking into pieces, too small to ever be put back together. He was alone again. Marcus stood in the doorway and watched the wolves walk away across the frozen plain, their bodies dark against the glittering white of the ice fields, their shadows stretching long in the morning light. He watched until they were small shapes in the distance, and then he watched some more, unwilling to turn away, unwilling to face the empty cargo bay behind him. When the wolves finally disappeared over a ridge and were gone from his sight, Marcus felt something inside him collapse like a building that had lost its foundation. He had been alone before they came, and he had survived, had built a life from scraps and spite, had proven that a single human could endure on this brutal world. But now he knew what he had been missing. Now he knew what it felt like to be part of something, to be accepted and protected and loved in that simple animal way that asked nothing in return, going back to the Silence and solitude felt like a death sentence of a different kind. He turned to go inside and stopped. The gray female was standing at the edge of his compound. Watching him, she had not left with the others. Behind her, one by one, the rest of the pack appeared over the ridge and began walking back toward the outpost, their 6 legs carrying them across the ice with the easy grace of creatures born to this land. Marcus could not move, could not breathe, could only stand there as 15 wolves returned to him. As they spread out across his compound and took up positions that he recognized from the knights inside the cargo. They guard positions, defensive positions. They were establishing a perimeter around his home. The juvenile, nearly healed now and walking without a limp, came directly to Marcus and pressed its head against his chest, exactly as it had done during the storm. And he felt tears running down his face for the second time in his life on this frozen world. The gray female approached with the measured dignity of a queen and stopped in front of him, her silver eyes meeting his with an intelligence that needed no translation. She made a sound, a single note that contained more meaning than any human word could hold. You are pack now. You are ours. We will not leave you. Marcus fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around her thick neck and wept like a child. And she stood there solid and warm and patient, letting him release the grief and loneliness that he had carried for so long. When he finally pulled away, she licked his face once, a gesture that felt like forgiveness and promise and family all wrapped into one. And then she moved to take her position at the center of the compound where she could watch over her territory that now included one strange hairless creature who had earned his place among them. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his entire life. The wolves did not live inside his outpost, that they never left the area around it, hunting in the surrounding plains and bringing him kills that he could never have made himself. More meat than he could possibly eat. They chased off the other predators that sometimes came near, driving them away with howls and snarls that echoed across the frozen landscape, protecting their territory with a ferocity that left no room for challenge. They warned him of approaching storms with enough time to prepare, gathering at his door with an urgency that he learned to recognize and trust. And every night when the temperature dropped to killing levels, 3 or 4 of them would appear at his door and wait to be let inside, wait to curl around him and share their warmth through the long dark hours until morning. Marcus learned to hunt with them, not as their equal, but as a strange supplement to their pack, using his technology to do things they could not do, using their senses to find prey he never could have located alone. He learned to communicate with them more fully, developing a language of sounds and gestures that bridged the gap between their species, expressing ideas and intentions that would have seemed impossible before the storm. He learned that the gray female had a name, or something like a name, a particular combination of sounds and postures that the other wolves used to identify her, and he learned to use it himself, earning a look of surprise and then something that might have been pleasure the first time he addressed her properly. He was no longer surviving, he was living. The rescue ship came 8 months after his abandonment, responding to the automated distress beacon that had been broadcasting his location into the void all along. Marcus was outside when he saw it descending through the atmosphere, a small craft that moved with the distinctive pattern of human technology. And his first emotion was not relief, but fear. Fear that they would take him away from this place. Fear that they would harm the creatures who had become his family. The pilot's voice crackled over the emergency frequency, speaking words that Marcus had imagined hearing for so long but that now sounded strange and almost threatening. There was a problem, the pilot said. There were dangerous animals surrounding the landing zone, apex predators that had killed armed survey teams in the past, and the pilot was requesting permission to use defensive measures to clear a safe path. Marcus looked at the wolves arranged in their guard positions around his compound, looked at the gray female standing at his side with her silver eyes fixed on the descending ship, looked at the juvenile who had grown so much since the night he had saved its life. He keyed his communication device and spoke with a voice that did not shake at all. He told the pilot that the wolves were not a threat, that they would not harm anyone, that they were under his protection, and he would not allow them to be hurt. The pilot was silent for a long moment, and then asked how that was possible. How a single unarmed human had somehow tamed a pack of creatures that were classified as extreme danger by every xenobiology database in the sector. Marcus thought about everything that had happened since the storm, thought about the choice he had made to open his door, thought about the trust that had been built through saved lives and shared warmth, and the simple willingness to see another creature as worthy of compassion. He looked at the gray female, and she looked back at him. And in her silver eyes, he saw everything that he had become during his time on this frozen world. He told the pilot that he had not tamed them. He told the pilot that they had chosen him, that they had recognized something in him that was worthy of their loyalty, that they had claimed him as pack, and he had claimed them in return. The ship landed, and the pilot emerged with wide, frightened eyes and a weapon held ready. And the wolves watched without moving, without threatening, without doing anything except standing guard around the human they had decided to protect. Marcus would tell this story many times in the years that followed, to scientists and journalists and anyone who wanted to understand what had happened on Korath 4. The xenobiologists would study the phenomenon for decades, writing papers about unprecedented interspecies bonding and pack integration, and the chemistry of trust between alien minds. They would miss the point entirely. What happened on that frozen world was not about science or biology or the mechanics of animal behavior. It was about a human who chose to open his door when every rational calculation said he should keep it closed. It was about compassion extended to creatures who could have killed him but who recognized in his actions something that earned their respect instead. It was about the simple truth that the universe is full of beings who will abandon the weak and calculate the worth of a life in profit and loss, but that some beings, some few precious beings, will risk everything to help a stranger in need. The wolves had seen that truth in Marcus' vein. They had seen it, and they had claimed him as their own. And on the morning after the storm, when the world was new and clean and full of golden light, they had shown him what it truly meant to be pack. The gray female pressed against his leg as the pilot stared in amazement, and Marcus placed his hand on her scarred head and smiled. He was not alone anymore. He never would be again.